My name is Jeff Nilsson, and this is the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Welcome to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. This is UC3P, our eponymously named podcast on policy, politics, and current affairs. My name is David Raban, and I'm the production manager for what we like to call the main page. Today, we continue with our limited run miniseries, Gun Violence, the Other Epidemic. In this episode, you'll hear from Mary Stonor Saunders, Executive Director of Strides for Peace. Strides for Peace is a nonprofit organization that aims to empower, amplify, and collaborate with community groups working to end gun violence in Chicago. This episode is all about community organization and how people can get involved now to save lives. No notes today, so let's get straight into the interview. Without further ado, here's the Executive Director of Strides for Peace, Mary Stonor Saunders.
In last week's episode, we spoke with Chris Brown, president of Brady. This week, we speak with Mary Stonor Saunders, the executive director of Strides for Peace, an organization that aims to empower, amplify, and collaborate with community groups working to end gun violence in Chicago.
Prior to working at Strides, Stonor Saunders served as director of strategy and development for BUILD, a gang intervention, violence prevention, and youth development organization, where she oversaw fundraising, external relations, and program development. She holds an MS from the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration and received a BA from Kenyon College.
Our conversation touched on the work Strides for Peace does and how it differs from advocacy organizations like Brady. We also discussed the importance of real-time local organizing to prevent gun violence. Stonor Saunders emphasized authenticity as a key factor in forming connections with affected communities.
We're here today with Mary Stonor Saunders from Strides for Peace. Mary, thank you for being with us.
Great, thanks for having me.
So Mary, can you tell us a little bit about your background and the work you're doing with Strides for Peace?
Yeah, well, I come from a pretty eclectic background across academia. I worked at the Washington Post. I've worked in hospitals, just across the board. But my work at Strides for Peace really comes from a deep place of passion, but also the ability that we can really affect some really positive change, or we're missing a lot of opportunities to do it. I came to this work where I had a pivotal moment where another young person was killed on the second day of school, 2:30 in the afternoon, a block away from his father, who was on a peace march to Antonio Goss. And that was a moment where I just said, I can't look away anymore. There had been a lot of other instances of gun violence that affected me before that, including Arnie Duncan speaking on CNN when he was the head of CPS when kids were getting killed, including a guy named Charles who worked at Medici down the block from the university, who had 5 kids and was killed over an argument one day for no reason. But at that moment, I started a journey of seeing how I could get involved. And it was a very lonely journey in the beginning because nobody was really focusing on this as an issue, including in the political realm. And it wasn't really until I started working for a community organization called BUILD in Austin that does youth development and gang intervention that I got the proximity I wanted and needed to the problem. And from there, got connected to Strides for Peace because we became one of their community partners, and then was invited to be Strides for Peace's inaugural executive director. And the rest is history.
All right. Thank you so much. So can you tell me a little bit more about what Strides for Peace sort of focuses on and any initiatives that they work on?
Well, so I think the origin story is a bit important here. So Strides was founded, created by a woman named Maggie Biskowski, who is in real estate and never worked in the nonprofit field. But like me, she had a moment where there was just one other death that she couldn't turn away from and decided to do something about it. And so she went around and asked people what was needed in the community. And what she found was that people on the front lines of the gun violence were so busy putting out fires and responding, that they didn't have the wherewithal to really sort of think about building capacity or getting in new funds. So she conceived of Strides as this organization that would create those opportunities for those partners so that they could, build their capacities. And also, I think she recognized very early that relationships was a really important part of that work, that in order, to have these effective partnerships, they can't just be one directional, but bi-directional, and there has to be a mutual respect and learning and interest in solving the problem. So since then, when I came on as executive director with a lot more background in nonprofit management in different sectors, I had an opportunity to really take Maggie's vision and sort of operationalize it in a way that was really accessible to our nonprofit partners. So what we do is we try to increase the collective impact of organizations working to end gun violence. And we do that by creating opportunities to empower them, and that could be with resources like financial, that could be with getting them pro bono work or me doing technical assistance and advising them. Then we also lay a table for collaboration. I can maybe talk about it in a minute, but the Race Against Gun Violence is an example of that. Or recently we organized a retreat with 9 organizations, 20 people to address trauma that they deal with on a regular basis. And then also Amplify, which is, we have academics, right? And we've got activists, and they're really good at pointing out what the problem is and what we need to do to fix it. And we need them to keep us honest. We need them to move us towards the right direction. But then there's this whole group of people who are really acting in the moment and now to save lives now. And that's what we want to talk about. They work across the imperfect systems. They work in partnership with people others think are sort of rivals or adversaries. But if you're going to save a life, if you're going to change a life, you're going to have to work across all sorts of lanes to make that happen. And so we try to help tell the story of that and have the opportunity for that to happen.
Wonderful. And so to what degree do you think Illinois is leading the charge on gun control legislation and advocacy as compared to federal gun laws and advocacy, for example?
Right. So as I was mentioning a bit earlier, Strides does not engage in political realm. In fact, we try to create a space that is distinctively apolitical, not because someone like me, who's a very political creature, doesn't have strong opinions about that, but we want to engage people across the spectrum of the issue so that change can happen by experience and proximity and deeper understanding of the problem. Now, I will tell you that the drivers of gun violence, right? You have poverty and you have segregation and you have trauma, you have economic issues that all contribute to it. Now, I believe, and this is my opinion, not Stride's opinion officially, that you add a gun into the mixture of that, you change the calculus. We're always going to have these problems in our society, and a gun exacerbates those problems because it only takes a second to fire a gun and you can't take a bullet back, right? So the worst mistake of your life is irrevocable and the worst possible outcome. But I think that there's a really strong community in Illinois around gun violence prevention and gun violence legislation. There's several organizations working on that front. And some of that is the national organizations like Moms Demand Action and Every Town Survivor Networks. And some of that is things like the Illinois Handgun Violence Coalition or the GPAC Coalition or the Brady Campaign. One of the things that I'm really pleased to see, which really relates to the work that Strides does, is I'm a personal believer that if you want to move people to action and to change the world, you can't just talk about things in esoteric terms, and you have to show them why it matters. And recently, things like Moms Demand Action, which focuses on legislative action and an expansive volunteer network. When I was part of it before Strides, there was like 4 of us, and now I think there's 40,000 in the state. They're doing a much better job connecting the issue to community violence and not just about these mass shootings that happen all too often, but much less often than community violence. And so I'm really pleased to see that aspect of it. And in fact, this year at the Women's March, Diane Latiker, one of our partners from Kids Off the Block, who's a phenomenal human being and has saved too many lives to count at this point. She convinced the Women's March organizers to include a gun violence block that was not just about legislation, but about the programming and what's happening on the community level. Because here's what I think is, love is this emotion and this thing that we feel, but love also is the underpinnings of pain and anger, because we don't feel pain and anger if something that we love isn't threatened. And so my view is we only fight for what we love. And part of the whole trajectory of advocacy in my mind is it can't be hypothetical. It can't be theoretical. It has to be coming from a place inside that you really care about it. So it's a very roundabout way to answer your question about advocacy. There's been huge gains on the political front, both in terms of the number of people engaged, even though that's not Stride's work. And there's been a recent advancement that I'm really pleased to see that takes that political advocacy but is doing a better job trying to engage the communities who are most impacted by this.
And what do some of those strategies look like?
Well, for instance, like Newtown, which has the Survivors Network, they started a national vigil for all victims of gun violence, which happens on the holiday season, and they do it in the National Cathedral, and around the country there's these sister, vigils that happen. And a few years ago, when the vigils would happen, they would only really talk about legislation, right? I mean, these are organizations that are dedicated to pushing legislation so that these shootings happen less. But over the last couple of years, under the leadership of Maria Pike and her dedicated volunteers, including me, have really made the survivors of gun violence at the forefront of the vigils, and really honoring the lives that were lost and the people who were left behind, and really humanizing what it means. And it doesn't mean that's to the exclusion of political action, but it's a moment to really bring in. So instead of just having people who go to Springfield or work on the Hill, you have people who have actually lost from gun violence who are part of that.
Hey, thanks for listening to UC3P, the main page. We know you're enjoying this episode, and we really want to get you back to it as soon as possible. The problem is, if you're listening to this, there's a really good chance you haven't subscribed to the show yet. Don't worry, that's super easy to fix. Just go on your phone, pick your favorite podcast app, and type in UC3P or the main page. It's easy to subscribe, and we know you don't want to miss any more episodes. Again, type in UC3P or the main page and subscribe. Now go tell a friend.
So you briefly mentioned this actually in your previous response, but a lot of the advocacy and the attention happens when we have really horrible events and mass shootings like those in Parkland, Newtown, and Aurora. So how does the advocacy space work or sort of emphasize the more community-based violence events that happen more often and in places that aren't as well represented in the media?
I've seen recently, it's really about collaboration and partnerships. So across Chicago, there's a lot of great organizations doing incredible work. And most people have only heard about the really large ones that have a lot of social and political capital and capacity, right, that are in the news or in partnerships. So Ready Chicago and Chicago Cred and Heartland Alliance, it's organizations like that. But there's a range of organizations that go from the one or two, sort of person operations that are really, truly, truly grassroots to ones that are maybe a bit bigger, but are really deeply connected to the community. And so what we do is Strides for Peace, and what there's a big appetite for, but there's actually a lot of barriers to this, is how do you sort of align the interests of the communities that are experiencing the gun violence, the people and the grassroots organizations that are doing what they can to ameliorate or mitigate the impact of gun violence and prevent it. And then also getting people to understand what's at stake on a larger systemic sense, right? So when you say advocacy, you could just talk about, gun legislation, but there's a lot of things to get communities and people around advocacy, right? So one of it might be about economic development. One of it might be about criminal justice reform. Another thing that I'm really working on right now is how we fund problem solving, right? So